Alexander the Great versus Julius Caesar.
Fight!
During the Antiquity era, two men named Alexander the Great and Gaius Julius Caesar became arguably the most influential men to ever live. Even though they lived over 2,000 years ago, their names and actions have ferociously echoed throughout all of history. Men and women for centuries have been trying to collect as much renown as both of these men, but only a few have ever come close to standing on the same level as these two historic titans. This video aims to compare and contrast the lives of Alexander and Caesar, which will be structured in the following format: early life, military accomplishments, governing, death, and legacy. After each of these sections, I will show a Venn diagram of our progress comparing and contrasting these two. Also, to remain as unbiased as humanly possible, this video will not be centered around which one of these two is better. Instead, it is up to you, the viewer, to decide whom you like better overall, as I will just be giving you the tools to help make this decision by summarizing their lives with the help of primary and secondary sources. So let us dive right in to talking about these two colossal men. The Antiquity era would give birth to two giants living in a land of insects. These giants would come to influence most facets of our ancient history and leave ginormous footprints that we can still perceive even to this very day. Our first giant, Alexander the Great, was born in Pella, Macedonia, in 356 BCE. Our second giant, Julius Caesar, was born in Rome, Italy, in 100 BCE. Alexander was the son and one of the many heirs to the famous military innovator and strategist King Philip II of Macedonia, and his mother, Olympias, who was a princess of Epirus. Julius Caesar's parents, however, were not of royalty, like Alexander's parents were, mainly because kings did not exist in Roman politics during this time. Rome was a republic, where the nobles of Roman society, called the patricians, ran the government as a collective called the Senate, rather than having a singular ruler such as a king. They instead had two consuls, who were senators elected by their fellow senators and held executive power. Caesar's father, who was also named Gaius Julius Caesar, was of patrician birth, being born into the house Julio-Claudian dynasty. Caesar's mother, Aurelia, was also of patrician birth. Alexander and Caesar were both claimed to be descendants of legendary rulers, warriors, and even gods. This was common practice among royalty and nobility in most parts of the ancient world to justify one's right to rule as a king or partake in any form of government affairs. Alexander was claimed to have been a descendant of the great Greek warrior Achilles, who fought in the Trojan War, and he was also rumored by his mother to be an actual son of Zeus, who was king of the Greek gods. Caesar claimed lineage on his father's side that he was a descendant of Julius, son of the Trojan prince Aeneas. Aeneas was rumored to have been the son of the Roman goddess Venus. Growing up in Macedonia, a young, eager, and energetic Alexander showed unlimited potential, as he was brave, charismatic, and showed a dogged determination to be the best at everything he put his mind to. He excelled in the Macedonian art of war, showing excellent swordsmanship, horsemanship, skills in archery, and battlefield strategy. He would even go on to be tutored by one of the most renowned philosophers ever to live in the ancient Greek world, Aristotle. Like Alexander, Caesar showed much potential as well. He was also very brave, charismatic, and showed much perseverance from an early age. However, Caesar lacked the wealth Alexander had, and even though Caesar was born into a patrician Roman family, they had lost a lot of influence in Roman politics and were declining in wealth many years before his birth. Even though Caesar's house was on the decline, he was still better off than most ordinary Roman citizens, and he still received a somewhat fruitful education. But it was not like the guidance of the great teacher that Alexander had in Aristotle. Caesar would face more hardships than Alexander later in his early life, mainly because his father died when he was just 16, and his uncle-in-law, Gaius Marius, lost a civil war to Lucius Cornelius Sulla. After Sulla's victory over Marius, Sulla would become the most powerful man in Rome at that time, and would be proclaimed dictator of Rome by the Roman Senate from 82 BCE to 79 BCE. Sulla's first order of business would be to create a list of his enemies of Rome, called proscriptions. These proscriptions would reward anyone who killed these enemies of Rome with lots of money, and anyone who dared to help these enemies would be put to death. And of course, Caesar's name was on these proscriptions because of his connections to Marius, and thus he lost his family's inheritance. He would be forced to divorce Cornelia, who was his wife at the time, and would no longer be able to pursue being high priest of Jupiter, which was his intended career path during his early life. Caesar would inevitably go into hiding until some of his influential extended family members and friends pleaded to Sulla to pardon him, to which Sulla reluctantly agreed. At this point in Caesar's early life, he would go on to join the Roman military, fearing that staying in Rome, even with Sulla pardoning him, was still too dangerous, because he knew that Sulla could change his mind at any moment. Many years later, when Caesar was a low-ranking officer at the age of 31 in Hispania, he saw a statue of Alexander the Great and was so disgusted with himself as he had not yet achieved the level of glory that Alexander had already achieved at his current age. This set a fire under Caesar, creating a huge burning flame of ambition within him that would make him ferociously follow his dreams, whatever the cost, for the rest of his life. Both men would come to see themselves written into the immortalized pages of human history when we talk about the tales of their legendary military accomplishments. But like all immortalized men, they would need to prove their mettle before they could become a figure unbound by the passages of time. In 336 BCE, at the age of 20, Alexander would ascend to the Macedonian throne after the tragic assassination of his father, Philip II, at the hands of his bodyguard, and take over his father's plans to invade the Greek and Macedonian arch-rival, the Persian Empire. Unlike Alexander, Caesar, who had spent years climbing the ladder of the renowned Roman military machine, was finally being recognized for his superior swordsmanship and his keen eye for battlefield strategy. He would win the admiration of the wealthiest man in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus, when they destroyed a slave revolt led by the legendary gladiator Spartacus. Using his silver tongue, he would then go on to convince Crassus's longtime rival, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, who was also known as Pompey the Great, to create a political alliance known as the First Triumvirate. It was at this moment that Caesar had accumulated the most power he had ever had up to this point, as Crassus and Pompey would persuade the Senate to elect Caesar as consul. Not only were consuls the chief executives of the Republic, they were also military generals, giving Caesar his first taste of having real influence over the Roman military. Alexander and Caesar were now both at the height of their power in their respective nations, which would let them chase after their ambitions to great effect. However, they still had a long road ahead of them, with many future military campaigns before they reached the goal of being immortalized throughout history. The beginning of Alexander's reign was not smooth sailing, as the Greek city-states were unified under Macedonian rule, thanks to Alexander's father, who conquered most of them, creating the League of Corinth, which made these Greek city-states puppet states to the Macedonians. These city-states were taking advantage of Philip's death and trying to gain their independence. Alexander moved swiftly against these Greek rebels, crushing revolts in Thessaly, Illyria, Thebes, Athens, and the northern Macedonian tribes of Thrace. Thebes would be the most resistant to Alexander, and he would go on to make an example out of them by committing horrible atrocities such as destroying most of the city and enslaving a massive amount of the Theban population to solidify Macedonian rule. After punishing the rebellious Greeks, it was time to set the grand invasion of the Persian Empire into motion. Alexander would bring a relatively small force of around 40,000 Macedonian and Greek soldiers, and also mercenaries, to combat the behemoth Persian military that was estimated to have been comprised of around 250,000 troops. These 40,000 men were not just your average army, however. These Macedonian and Greek forces were very well trained killing machines, mainly due to King Philip making big innovations to the Macedonian army by creating the Macedonian phalanx formation, which proved to be a very formidable battle formation. This highly trained and newly innovated military would play a huge part in Alexander's incredible conquest of the Persians. Likewise, Caesar had also been fortunate to be born in the Roman Republic, which by the time of his birth had one of the most reputable armies and best military engineering methods the ancient world had ever seen. Both Alexander and Caesar would use these to their advantage and take on legendary military challenges. At the dawn of the invasion of Persia, Alexander would cross the Hellespont in 334 BCE. He would then be met by a Persian force that slightly outnumbered his own, and was led by the Persian satrap Arsaces at the Battle of the Granicus. The fighting was brutal, with Alexander nearly being killed, but was saved heroically by one of his cavalry commanders, Clytus, who had swiftly rode up behind Alexander's Persian attacker and sliced his sword arm off. Though with the shock of Alexander almost meeting his demise, his army won a decisive victory, and Alexander claimed his army had lost barely any men. Comparatively, Caesar's greatest military campaign was subjugating the Gallic, Celtic, and Germanic tribes to the north of the Italian peninsula, which would be no easy feat. This would later be known as the Gallic Wars. This was perfect timing, as Caesar's tenure as consul came to a close by 58 BCE, and he was given 3 governorships in Transalpine Gaul, Cisalpine Gaul, and Illyria, all of which were situated to the north of Rome, conveniently close to most of these tribes. Caesar desperately needed the money that the raging of war gifted, as he was in debt to Crassus, and also saw this as an opportunity to immortalize his name in the history books next to Alexander. Though Gaul was not a unified nation like the Persian Empire was, the tribes were constantly at war with one another, showing their drive to be independent even from their sister tribes. Also, these tribes were rumored to be comprised of fearless and skilled warriors who had sacked Rome in 390 BCE. The sacking of Rome fueled the Roman people's deep fear and hatred for them. Caesar knew if he could conquer all of Gaul, it would ascend him to godhood amongst the Roman people. Unlike Alexander, who was a king and had absolute authority, Caesar did not have the authority to make a formal declaration of war against any tribes in Gaul, as he would need the Senate's approval. Instead, Caesar would use Rome's Gallic ally, the Aedui, who were under constant threat of going to war with other neighboring tribes. He would aid them against any other tribes attacking them. This would make Caesar's initial intervention in Gaul look defensive instead of offensive, which he thought would not stir up any grievances against him among the senators. Another contrast we can make is that between Alexander's and Caesar's biggest military accomplishments is that Caesar's first engagement with the tribes in Gaul was more like border patrol, as he had to stop tribes from migrating into Roman lands and other lands that were controlled by Rome's allies, though eventually it did get bloody. Alexander's first engagement was of course a pitched battle at the Granicus River. Caesar would get the news that a confederation of Celtic tribes from the southeastern parts of Gaul, named the Helvetii, Boii, Tulingi, Rauraci, and the Latobrigi, all led by Divico, who was the king of the Helvetii. These tribes were planning on migrating to the west coast of Gaul. Caesar knew the fastest route for them would be passing through Roman and Aedui lands. Although Caesar was still in Rome at this time, he would raise all of his available legions swiftly and head for Transalpine Gaul to block their migration. Caesar would eventually catch up to the Celtic tribes at a border town between Roman and Aedui lands called Geneva. He took one of his available legions and positioned them on the river embankment between the town and the Celtic tribes. Divico then sent letters to Caesar, pleading to let them cross, but Caesar refused. The Celtic tribes would then give up pleading and turn around, looking to take a more northern route through Aedui lands to bypass the Romans. As they stormed through Aedui lands, they would begin pillaging and burning villages. The Aedui then sent letters begging for Caesar's help. And of course, Caesar, who was looking for any excuse to start a war in Gaul, accepted. Caesar's first real engagement with the Celtic tribes was at the Battle of the Arar River, where his forces caught up to the Celtic tribes by surprise when they were crossing the river. The battle was a victory for him, as he managed to slaughter around a fourth of the Celtic tribes' forces, and the rest of them fled toward the nearby town of Bibracte. Divico would try to negotiate peace with Caesar after the battle, but negotiations would be unsuccessful, as the terms proposed on both sides did not meet the satisfaction of the Romans or the Celtic tribes. After the victory at the Battle of the Granicus, Alexander would go to Sardis, the capital of the province of Lydia, where he met no resistance as the city surrendered to him immediately. Alexander would continue down the coast of southwest Anatolia and take back the once Greek cities of Miletus and Halicarnassus. After these initial victories, he would go on to take at least 30 more Persian towns until he faced his next big obstacle during the Battle of Issus in 33 BCE. Finally, the king of kings himself, Darius III, was at the head of the Persian forces that was estimated by modern-day sources to have slightly outnumbered Alexander's forces, as the Persians had around 50,000 to 60,000 men. Other ancient sources say it could have been over 100,000 men strong. The Persians surprised Alexander's forces by coming from the north and taking back the town of Issus from a small detachment of Alexander's army that was stationed there, and eventually trapped the rest of Alexander's forces in a 6-mile-wide area between the Nur Mountains and the Mediterranean Sea, cutting off their supply lines. Many ancient sources have significantly different accounts of how this battle played out, but for all of them, the conclusion is mostly the same. As Alexander barreled towards Darius from the Persian left flank with his companion cavalry, he saved his Macedonian phalanx, which was struggling to hold its formation fighting off the Persian forces in the center. Darius, frantically fearing for his own life, after seeing the monstrous Macedonian king fearlessly cut through his left flank like paper, and now galloping towards him, would retreat from the battlefield. Once Darius started to flee, the rest of the Persian army followed in his footsteps, handing a great victory over to Alexander, who once again claimed that his army had sustained very minimal casualties. Similarly, Caesar's second battle against the Celtic tribes during the Battle of Bibracte would also be a great victory for the Romans, as they managed to push the Celtic tribes back to a nearby mountain, where the legions would be able to rout most of the Celtic tribes' forces. The Tulingi and Boii were the last to keep fighting, as they fell back to their wagon train. They managed to hold off the Romans for several hours, but were then flanked on both sides by the Roman third line, and the rest of the Tulingi and Boii forces were killed. After the battle, Caesar ordered his legions after the fleeing tribes to finish them off. However, the remaining tribe members saw the Romans chasing them, and surrendered before it became another bloodbath. The Celtic tribes were forced to go back to their homelands by Caesar and be made a vassal to Rome. Alexander and Caesar, at the start of their most famous campaigns, so far were off to an immaculate start. The Persians tried to put up a fight, but posed no challenge compared to Alexander's undefeated army, as Alexander swiftly started taking over the southwestern provinces of Persia. He would siege the coastal cities of Marathus, Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. He would then make his way to Egypt, where he would have a successful siege against the city of Gaza and then take the cities of Pelusium and Memphis without any resistance, and be crowned Pharaoh of Egypt in Memphis for liberating the Egyptians from Persian control. He would also go on to take the most western Persian province of Libya as well. After Alexander's extraordinary conquest of Egypt and Libya, he believed it was time for him to invade the heart of the Persian Empire and finish off Darius once and for all. In 331 BCE, he had gotten reports from his scouts that Darius had fled to the area of Gaugamela, which is located in the north of modern-day Iraq, and was assembling a large Persian force there. Seeing this as a chance to finally end Darius's reign, he set out to Gaugamela in great haste, and this epic showdown that was about to ensue would be known as the Battle of Gaugamela. Though modern-day historians don't know the exact number of Persian forces Darius had at the Battle of Gaugamela, it was estimated to be anywhere from 50,000 to over 100,000. Many modern-day historians speculate that Alexander was probably outnumbered 2 to 1 at least. At the beginning of the battle, Alexander yet again would outflank Darius with his companion cavalry, breaking the lines of the Persian infantry and fighting his way to Darius. Darius, sensing the battle was lost again, fled the battlefield, but this time Alexander was determined to catch up to the King of Kings and finish him off. Though in a twist of fate, Alexander's cavalry on his left flank, who was commanded by his second-in-command, Parmenion, was being encircled by Persian cavalry. He got word of this from some of his fellow soldiers, and he immediately stopped his pursuit of Darius and went to help his forces, fearing that he could lose a good chunk of his army. Alexander charged into the circle of Persians, catching them off guard, which ended up routing them. Alexander finished the battle as the victor, but was upset about letting Darius slip through his fingertips once again. On the other hand, Caesar was now dealing with a new foreign enemy, a Germanic tribe called the Suebi, led by the feared king Ariovistus, who had in the past fought on the side of the Gallic tribes of the Sequani and Averni against the Aedui. The Aedui had lost the war, making them fork over annual tributes to the Sequani. Ariovistus had been promised Sequani territory after helping them defeat the Aedui, so he was migrating his people across the Rhine into his new lands. However, Ariovistus was becoming more and more greedy and taking more Sequani lands than he was gifted. He also took Sequani and Aedui people as hostages to gain leverage over them, so he could take even more of their lands with less resistance. Sequani and Aedui leaders eventually met with Caesar and begged for his help to lead forces against the terrifying Suebi threat. Surprisingly, Caesar was hesitant to challenge Ariovistus, as he had been declared a friend of Rome. Caesar, however, did see it as a good opportunity to occupy more Gallic lands, so he devised a diplomatic plan, as he would send proposals to Ariovistus, making it look like he tried to persuade the king to stand down. Doing this would make Caesar look like he was acting in Rome's best interest instead of his own. Caesar had a very good hunch that Ariovistus would deny his proposals because he knew he was a power-hungry and stubborn man. This would give Caesar a better excuse to declare a once good friend of Rome as an enemy. Ariovistus, of course, went on to deny Caesar's proposals. Caesar would march his troops quickly to the last known position of Ariovistus, which was in Sequani territory near the town of Vecentillo. The battle that would ensue would be called the Battle of the Vosges. When it started, the historical accounts from the Romans themselves say that the Suebi were so fast in their charge that the front line of the legions didn't even have time to throw their javelins, as the Suebi were known to be great warriors with lightning-fast speed. Caesar saw that the Suebi's left flank was weaker than its right, due to fewer Suebi warriors positioned on that side, so he positioned himself with one of his cavalry units nearest their left flank and started to break through the Suebi lines. However, the Suebi on the right were able to break through Caesar's left flank, and his lines on the left started to break. Seeing that the Roman left flank was in trouble, a Roman cavalry commander named Marcus Licinius Crassus, who was the son of Caesar's political ally, who shared the same name, took his cavalry and part of the Roman third line of legionaries that had been in reserve and charged against the Suebi flanking them, and thus saving the Roman left flank. The Suebi, seeing that their left flank was severely destroyed, and the Romans had stopped their advancement on their left flank, started to rout, giving Caesar a costly victory. After Caesar's victory, the Suebi crossed back over the Rhine into their original territory, ending their campaign against the Romans, Sequani, and Aedui. After his campaign against the Suebi, Caesar left a few legions in Aedui and Sequani territory in case the Suebi returned, while he rested and resumed his governing responsibilities back in Cisalpine Gaul during the winter. Though a new threat was looming on the horizon, by 57 BCE, a bunch of northeastern Gallic tribes had formed a coalition called the Belgae Confederation. It was led by Galba, king of the Suetians, against Caesar as they perceived the vassalage of the Helvetii and the legions who were now stationed in Sequani and Aedui territory as a sign of the Romans moving in to occupy all of Gaul, and suspected that they would be next to be occupied by the Romans. Caesar had gotten wind of this new threat from his legions stationed in Gaul. He would go on to rally more Romans to his cause, raising a couple more legions before meeting up with the rest of his army in Gaul. From Gaul, he sent an Aedui force to the west of Belgae lands, while Caesar attacked the main force at Exana to the east. The Battle of Exana would be a tremendous loss for the Belgae, as before the battle even started, Galba had received news that the Aedui were attacking their lands from the west as well. They got overwhelmed by getting the news that they were fighting a two-front campaign and retreated. The retreat from Exana would be a mistake, however, as they would lose upwards of 10,000 men as the Romans eventually caught up to them, butchering many Belgae soldiers. After this humiliating defeat, Galba and his Suetians, as well as another Gallic tribe in the Confederation, known as the Bellovaci, surrendered. Though that was not the end of the Confederation, as the remaining tribes would go on to rally behind a new king called Boduganatus of the Nervi tribe. Caesar, who eventually got news of this new leader and that the remnants of the Belgae Confederation were reorganizing against him, marched his legions up to the Sabis River, where he would meet Boduganatus and his forces at the Battle of the Sabis, and this time the Belgae would not retreat. This battle would go on to be one of Caesar's hardest fought yet during his campaign in Gaul, because his legions had been split up by Nervi defensive emplacements, resulting in almost 3 different battles happening simultaneously in a wide range of different areas, making it hard for Caesar to communicate orders to his legions. Caesar's forces on the left of him had managed to push back the Nervi forces back to the Nervi camp, killing a good chunk of them. Caesar's middle line was also doing well, as they managed to push the Nervi forces all the way back into the Sabis River. However, Caesar's right was beginning to fall apart, as they were outnumbered and eventually became encircled. Even Caesar's cavalry had fled, fearing that the battle may be lost. At this moment during the battle, it is said that Caesar picked up a shield himself and charged into the enemy front lines, then began yelling for his legions to form a defensive square formation and hold their positions. Brutal fighting ensued, and then the battle turned in Caesar's favor, as the rest of Caesar's forces saw what was happening and came to help as they charged into the rear of the unsuspecting Nervi forces, crushing them. After the battle, the Belgae Confederation surrendered and became vassals to Rome, expanding Roman borders even further into Gaul. By 56 BCE, Caesar had taken most of the remaining territories of Gaul, either through diplomacy or putting down small uprisings here and there. Though Caesar would face another significant obstacle, a tribe known as the Veneti, located in modern-day Brittany, France, who used their formidable navy instead of fighting Caesar on land. Although at first, the Veneti were very troublesome, as they had taller and sturdier ships than the Romans. However, Caesar and his forces figured out a weakness to the Veneti ships, and were eventually able to beat them and take control over their lands as well. Both Alexander and Caesar were reaching the midway points of their military accomplishments at this point. The world was starting to see them as decently accomplished military leaders. Alexander would reach the main Persian capital of Babylon, and the city would fall to its knees without a fight, surrendering to him almost immediately after his arrival. At Babylon, he would be formally declared the new king of kings by Persian officials. Next, he went to Susa, where he ceremoniously sat on the Persian throne to even further solidify his rule. Finally, he would make it to Persepolis, the once original capital, and now the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, after he defeated a small Persian resistance in the mountains called the Persian Gates. While in Persepolis, Alexander ordered the pillaging and burning of the sacred temples. This was revenge for the Persians' sacking of Greek sacred temples during the Greco-Persian Wars 150 years prior. During this time, Darius was scrounging up any remaining forces in the eastern provinces of the empire at the city of Ecbatana. This would be cut short, however, as one of Darius' satraps, named Bessus, killed Darius and declared himself king of kings. Alexander, who was distraught by this, gave Darius a ceremonial funeral in Persepolis, and then swore revenge on Bessus. On his way east, on the trail of Bessus, he would subdue another Persian rebel by the name of Satybrazanes. In the Persian region of Aria, he would then get reports that Bessus was in Kunduz, which was a city located in the northern part of modern-day Afghanistan. However, when Alexander arrived in the city, conveniently, the whole Persian army had turned against Bessus and imprisoned him, as they wanted to hand him over to Alexander as a peace offering. Alexander would have him gruesomely tortured and then sent back to Ecbatana to be executed. After finally getting revenge on Bessus for the murder of Darius, Alexander then led his army to the northeastern Persian territory of Sogdia, where he would subdue Persian resistance there. Alexander would also have to fight the Scythians to the north of Sogdia, who were longtime enemies of the Persians. They would send raids against his forces, which would become quite bothersome. Alexander would form a plan to draw out the Scythians by luring most of their army to an area close to the Jaxartes River, where Alexander would win a decisive victory against them, which stopped them from raiding his new lands. Alexander and Caesar's campaigns were going very smoothly at this point, with both conquering a good amount of territory. However, politically, things were getting out of hand for the both of them. Alexander had started to see many of his men lose respect for him, because he began to wear traditional Persian clothing and take many Persian wives. This disgusted the Macedonians and the Greeks, as they did not want to befriend the Persians. They wanted to conquer them. Alexander was also under constant threat of assassination at this point, as he would see more and more attempts on his life. Although he eventually succeeded in stopping all of these plots by executing the suspects. Caesar was also getting into hot water with the Senate, but unlike Alexander's political problems, Caesar's political problems were different. Caesar's conquests in Gaul were becoming increasingly unpopular amongst his political rivals, who thought he was gaining too much fame and power from his conquests, making them very nervous about where their political futures lie. Crassus and Pompey in particular were getting worried, as Caesar was becoming very famous among the common people, which was a potential threat to their influence in Roman politics. Crassus would even make a very bold move as he invaded a long-time strong rival of Rome, known as Parthia, to gain more glory so he could match Caesar. Though the invasion of Parthia led by Crassus would fail miserably at the Battle of Carrhae, where he died in 53 BCE. Pompey's relationship with Caesar started to go downhill after Caesar's daughter Julia died in 54 BCE, who was married to Pompey during this time, but he did not openly condemn Caesar till around 51 BCE. Caesar knew that the Senate was becoming more and more against him, so he decided to make a series of political invasions to try and gain the favor of the Roman people. He would set his sights on the islands northwest of Gaul, called Britannia, which was a perfect Roman propaganda target at the time. The reason why it was so perfect was that the islands of Britannia were rumored by the Romans to hold a massive amount of treasure. The native populace there was supposedly very well trained and organized military-wise. And it was even rumored that mythical beasts from Roman legends lived in Britannia. Caesar knew that he didn't even have to conquer the island at all, and all he needed to do was just send a small military expeditionary force to extend his glory amongst the Roman people. However, Caesar was not the type of man to make small safe bets. Instead, Caesar thought it would be more glorifying to his military and political career if he tried to conquer as much of Britannia as he could. Caesar started his invasion of Britannia in 55 BCE with 2 legions at his disposal, and as he got closer to Britannia with his naval force, he saw huge white cliffs, which were known to be the Cliffs of Dover. On these cliffs, he saw a native military force, known as the Britons, watching him. Caesar had initially planned to land in a port near the Cliffs of Dover, but was very hesitant to do so once he saw the Briton forces lined up on the cliffs. He instead decided to land about 11 kilometers northeast in Pegwell Bay. Half of the Briton forces decided to follow him. These Briton forces were mostly comprised of cavalry and started shooting arrows at the invading Romans when the Romans started getting off of their ships. The landing would prove difficult for the Romans as they leapt from their ships into waist-high water and being pelted by arrows which became very demoralizing, making some Romans reluctant to get off of their ships. Though eventually, an unnamed Roman standard bearer leapt out of the ship while trying to convince his fellow Romans to join him, which sent a huge morale boost throughout the men, and eventually the Romans were able to push back the defending Britons, giving them a chance to establish a beachhead for the army. Caesar would go on to win a few successful small battles during his first invasion. However, Caesar had a huge lack of supplies, and his ships were under constant threat of being destroyed by the harsh weather. He eventually had to sail back to Gaul, knowing he would need more men and create a more up-to-date naval logistical system to help supply his troops if he had any chance of conquering Britannia. Even though he failed in his first invasion attempt, Caesar saw it as a political success, as a 20-day celebration of his attempt at such a difficult invasion was held in Rome. In 54 BCE, he would attempt another invasion of Britannia, this time with 5 legions and a lot more supplies. He landed in Pegwell Bay again, but was met with no resistance because the Britons had seen that the Romans had a much bigger military force this time around. He then left a small detachment of legionaries to guard Pegwell Bay, as he would go out into the mainlands of Britannia and besiege a nearby hill fort considered by modern-day historians to be Big Bury Camp in Kent, England. It was a success, as he took the fort, but on the other hand, he got some bad news from Pegwell Bay, as a storm had destroyed several of his ships. He would then order his main force back to Pegwell Bay to oversee repairs on the ships, and he also ordered his men to build a huge wall around Pegwell Bay to make it more secure. He then set out once again for the mainland, and had saw that the Britons had retaken the hill fort in Kent, and all of his hard work was undone. To make matters even worse, the Britons had created a coalition against the Romans before they began their second invasion. This coalition was led by a man named Cassivellaunus, who was now at the hill fort with an even larger force this time around. Caesar was reluctant to take the fort again, seeing how much bigger the army was, and instead started burning and pillaging nearby villages to try to draw out the forces from the hill fort. Though this did not work, as Cassivellaunus knew better than to fight the Romans in a pitched battle, and instead used guerrilla tactics against Caesar. Though Caesar was not out of luck yet, as he figured out a way to find out where Cassivellaunus' base of operations was held, by siding with a local tribe named the Trinovantes, who were also fighting against Cassivellaunus. Caesar, with this new information, finds out that the Briton stronghold was in modern-day Wheathampstead, so he began to siege it. Cassivellaunus sent part of his army to attack Caesar's fortified camp at Pegwell Bay as a distraction to try to divert Caesar's main army back to Pegwell Bay to defend it. But the Britons' attack failed, as it was now heavily fortified and the defending Roman forces put up a very good fight. The war would come to a stalemate, however, with both sides conceding to negotiate peace terms, as Caesar would gain hostages and tribute, but would have to leave the lands of Britannia unoccupied by Roman legions, which would be considered a Roman failure, as they did not conquer any lands in Britannia and did not capture Cassivellaunus. Though Caesar had not conquered Britannia, he still accomplished a tremendous feat by being the first to attempt to do so. This would also start a Roman precedent of trying to bring Britannia into the Roman fold, even well after Caesar's death. Furthermore, Alexander was also about to accomplish a tremendous feat, as he would send his forces into India, finally stepping foot at the rumored end of the known world. In 327 BCE, Alexander, after a short military hiatus, would resume subjugation of the last 4 provinces in southeastern Persia, which is known today as modern-day parts of India and Pakistan. He would have to pass through the harsh terrain of the Hindu Kush Mountains to reach the Indus River Valley, where he would send envoys to the chieftains of the Persian Gandhara province to force them into acknowledging that Alexander was the rightful king of kings. Alexander would only get one of the chieftains to acknowledge his rule. His name was Omphis, the ruler of Taxila. The rest of the chieftains would condemn Alexander. This forced Alexander to acknowledge them as his enemy. His first major engagement during his India campaign was taking the city of Masaga. After the siege of Masaga, Alexander and his new allies from Taxila would battle King Porus of Paravas, which would come to be known as the Battle of the Hydaspes. It was the most brutal battle Alexander was ever involved in. It is said by modern-day estimates that he had lost about 1,000 men, which is the most men he had ever lost in a single battle. He had sustained these casualties due to the use of war elephants by King Porus. But the Macedonian and Greek forces, with the help of their new allies from Taxila, were able to find and exploit weaknesses against the elephants, and eventually won the battle against Porus, allowing Alexander to take control of the Gandhara province. It was at this point that Alexander's army had completely mutinied because of him being greedy with his ambitions of wanting to conquer all of what today is known as modern-day India, most of which was not even under Persian control. They wanted to go back home to Greece and Macedonia, as they heard rumors of ginormous Indian armies waiting for them, which made them even more reluctant to carry on. Alexander was enraged by his army's lack of confidence, but in the end complied with their demands not to go into India and started marching south to subjugate the rest of the Persian provinces. He would go on to conquer many other Indian tribes as he followed the Indus River through the remaining Persian provinces. He would send a good chunk of his army to Carmania in modern-day southern Iran and commissioned those forces to build a fleet and sail on an expedition through the Persian Gulf under the command of Alexander's admiral Nearchus. Alexander would then take the rest of his army through the Gedrosian desert. Finally, he would make it back to Susa in 324 BCE, ending his illustrious undefeated campaign against the once mighty Persian Empire. In similar fashion, Caesar was about to cement Roman supremacy in all of Gaul, though one obstacle would stand in his way, and that obstacle's name was Vercingetorix. In 52 BCE, after Caesar had crushed the Belgae uprising led by Ambiorix the year prior, he had returned to Rome as tensions between him and Pompey had started to rise. During his time in Rome, he had gotten news that more and more Gallic tribes, mainly from the central parts of Gaul, were starting to revolt. This had been influenced by Ambiorix's revolt, and the leader behind this new massive uprising was the king of the Averni tribe, Vercingetorix. Caesar swiftly mobilized his legions against this revolt, as he took back territories from the Senones and Carnutes tribes. He then set his sights on the tribe known as the Bituriges to the south, and attacked their border town named Novio Dunum. It was here where Caesar would face Vercingetorix for the first time, and Caesar defeated him. Caesar would then take Avaricum, the capital of the Bituriges, defeating Vercingetorix again, who was assisting the Bituriges. After Caesar took Avaricum, he decided to turn his sights on Vercingetorix's lands. Specifically, Caesar wanted to take his capital, called Gergovia. Though he started the siege of Gergovia off very strong by cutting off the supply lines to the town, and was planning on encircling it. But then he was met with a string of bad luck, as his longtime Gallic ally, the Aedui, had taken a bribe from Vercingetorix to turn on him. Caesar, now fearing that he would become encircled by his enemies, decided to leave 2 legions in Gergovia to continue the siege, and with the rest of his forces headed straight for Bibracte to subdue the Aedui, which was ultimately a success. And as punishment, he would also demand the Aedui to give him command over all of their cavalry units, giving Caesar a major bolster to his cavalry, which would give him a better chance of taking Gergovia. Once he got back to Gergovia, he noticed that the siege forces that he had left there had taken a good amount of casualties, but were still holding on. Caesar would then send his legions to attack the city, and at first he was succeeding, but then he ordered his men to retreat, knowing Vercingetorix would send the rest of his men to reinforce them and attack his legions from behind. Incidentally, only one of Caesar's 4 legions he sent to attack the city heard the retreat order, with the other 3 still stuck in the heat of battle. At this point, Vercingetorix had reinforced his men and began to outflank the Roman left, cutting through their lines easily. Fearing for their lives, as they thought they were going to be fully encircled by the enemy, the legions began to retreat. Seeing his retreating army, Caesar sent all of his available units around him to support their retreat, and for the most part, their retreat would be successful. He was very relieved by this, as he thought he was about to lose most of his army. He then withdrew, saying in his casualties report that there were only 46 centurions and 700 legionaries dead, which is considered not accurate by modern-day historians, as the real estimates put it around 5,000 to 6,000 Romans killed, making it Caesar's most devastating defeat up until this point. Vercingetorix would be celebrated for beating Caesar and would have more eager tribes join his cause. Caesar rebounded, however, beating Vercingetorix during a small skirmish near the Vingon River. It is at this point that many modern historians hypothesize that Vercingetorix realized he could never beat the Romans in a pitched battle, and thus tried to emulate the events of Gergovia, thinking it was the only way that he could beat the Romans. Vercingetorix fled to the nearby town of Alesia, which was very well fortified, and waited for the Romans to make their first move. With no other real choice, Caesar led his men to Alesia to lay siege, fearing that it could end up like Gergovia, but also confident that he could crush this rebellion quickly if he could capture or kill Vercingetorix. Being in a strong position, Vercingetorix outnumbered Caesar's army 2-1, and could call in his allies who surrounded Caesar on all sides. Knowing this, Caesar would order his men to create a military engineering gem, which was building a wall facing Alesia, then building a second wall facing outwards to guard their rear against enemy reinforcements. And then he waited, as he would try to starve out Vercingetorix and his men. Vercingetorix, knowing food supplies were running short, made the civilian population leave the city, giving his men more time, and hoped that Caesar would let the civilian population pass by to safety. Caesar, however, was not in a merciful mood, and denied taking in any of the civilians, thus leading to them staying in between the Gallic and Roman forces, where they eventually all starved to death. After a small bit of time had passed, finally Vercingetorix's reinforcements made it to Alesia, under the leadership of his cousin, Vercassivellaunus. The reinforcements were said to be comprised of around 100,000 men, by modern-day estimates. At first, the reinforcing Gauls sent a small force to probe for any weaknesses in the structure of the outer walls, but were easily pushed back by the Roman forces. The second attempt by the Gauls, however, proved to be more brutal for the Romans, as most of the Gauls were spread out in different areas along the outer wall, hoping to spread the Romans thin. At this point, Vercingetorix also mounted his attack on the inner wall, knowing that the Romans would be occupied with guarding the outer wall. Although Vercingetorix's attack did not go as planned, as the Romans had pushed back the Gauls, who were attacking the outer wall. And then the Romans started reinforcing the inner wall, knowing the Gauls were about to attack it. So Vercingetorix commanded his men attacking the inner wall to retreat back towards Alesia. On the third assault attempt by the Gauls attacking the outer wall, they would spread their armies even further around the outer wall, trying to spread the Romans even thinner. Vercassivellaunus also used a mountain to the town's northwest as a vantage point to better direct his armies and lead his main force to attack that side of the wall. Vercingetorix at this point had also begun to attack the inner wall and was finally making some progress. This was the bloodiest the battle had gotten, especially for the Romans. Caesar, thinking that this was the point where the outer walls could fall and all would be lost, led his cavalry outside the walls and snuck through a gap in the Gallic lines, and ended up right behind their main force, leading to a monstrous surprise attack on the Gauls. Seeing their largest force completely crushed and fearing that it could maybe be Roman reinforcements, the remaining Gauls attacking the outer wall retreated. After being relieved by the outer wall not being under constant Gallic threat anymore, the rest of the Romans pushed back Vercingetorix's forces attacking the inner wall, until the Gauls finally retreated behind Alesia's walls. Vercingetorix, seeing the reinforcements crushed, and now Alesia about to fall by Roman siege, finally surrendered to the Romans. Though the war in Gaul was not completely over, as Caesar would need to finish off the remaining tribes that were still in open revolt. From 51 BCE to 50 BCE, he did just that, as the Gauls were never able to truly put up a fight like they did when they had Vercingetorix at the head of their army. Caesar had finally done the impossible by bringing Gaul under Roman rule. From that moment on, Caesar had truly cemented himself into the immortalized pages of human history. Though this would not be the end of Caesar's participation in military campaigns, as his relationship with longtime political ally Pompey had started to degrade by this point, and a civil war between two of Rome's most powerful men was looking inevitable. In 49 BCE, Caesar's civil war began, when Caesar broke the laws of Rome by crossing the Rubicon River with an army while saying one of the most iconic phrases, "The die is cast." Once he got back to Rome with his legions, he took the city without a fight. As Pompey had already left for Greece to gather the rest of his legions, Caesar, hearing of Pompey's plan, chased him down to the city of Brundisium, but was unsuccessful in stopping Pompey, who had taken almost every ship in the harbor for his army to cross the Adriatic Sea. Though Caesar had failed to stop Pompey from reaching Greece, and could not follow him without building more ships, so he decided to take advantage of the situation and attack the Roman province of Hispania, which was loyal to Pompey. This would help secure his left flank, making it so that he did not have to fight Pompey's forces on two fronts. Along the way, Caesar raised more legions and also laid siege to the Pompey-loyal city of Massilia, but left halfway through the siege to take Hispania as quickly as he could, leaving some of his legions to continue the siege in his stead. He then met a Pompeian force at the Battle of Aletta, where he would be victorious. He then went after Marcus Terentius Varro, who was the last military leader supporting Pompey in Hispania. Varro surrendered almost immediately to Caesar, however, as his legions mutinied against him, since they saw no chance of winning after seeing Caesar's victory at Aletta. After securing Hispania, Caesar went back to the siege at Massilia, which would surrender to him a short while after his return. After securing his left flank, Caesar was eager to cross the Adriatic Sea, to face Pompey and end this war once and for all, because he hated fighting his fellow Romans. Caesar was so eager, in fact, that he decided to cross the Adriatic Sea with only half of his army, as the rest of his fleet was not yet built. But he knew time was of the essence. The other half of his legions was left in command by Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted officer. Though by a stroke of luck and strong haste by Antony, he was able to reconnect with Caesar in Greece, only in a few short months, near the Greek city of Asparagium, where Pompey and his legions resided. Though even with Caesar's army fully reunited, he was still outnumbered by Pompey's army almost 2-1. Caesar had been outnumbered many times before, so this of course would not stop his ambition of winning the war. Caesar then marched his legions towards the city of Dyrrachium, trying not to alert Pompey of what he was doing, as he knew that taking Dyrrachium was a crucial supply hub for Pompey's forces. He then built huge walls of fortifications stretching along Pompey's camp, trying to cut off any more supply lines that Pompey's forces could use to supply themselves from other parts of Greece. Pompey, who quickly figured out what Caesar was doing, had his forces also build huge walls around his camp, which would stretch Caesar's walls even further, forcing Caesar's army to cover a vast amount of territory. A stroke of bad luck would hit Caesar, however, as a couple of his high-ranking officers would defect from his army to Pompey's army. These officers would give Pompey information about where the weak points were in Caesar's fortifications, and which sides of the wall were less defended than others. Pompey would attack what he deemed the weakest point to the wall was, and was very successful in taking a portion of Caesar's fortified area. Caesar knew that Pompey gaining a foothold in his fortifications could be costly, so he mounted a counterattack, but was tremendously unsuccessful, losing just over 1,000 men. Caesar, seeing his men demoralized and now Pompey having the upper hand, decided to retreat and think about his next move, handing Pompey a victory at Dyrrachium. Their next big engagement at the Battle of Pharsalus had Caesar more cautious than before, as he would ready a plan to deal with Pompey's cavalry, which was Pompey's greatest advantage over Caesar, because Pompey had almost 7,000 cavalry units over Caesar's meager 3,000. Caesar at the beginning of the battle had his legions in 3 lines, forming the triplex axis formation. Pompey would also have his men in the same formation. Caesar would make the first move, as he ordered his first 2 lines to charge at Pompey's forces, keeping his 3rd line back as a reserve. Caesar's legions stopped halfway, however, as they expected the Pompeian forces to countercharge. But they did not, which was unusual in ancient warfare battle tactics. Caesar's attacking forces showed great discipline, however, as they rested for a brief moment and then reorganized to charge again. This time they finally met Pompey's main force, and a brutal battle ensued. Pompey then ordered his cavalry to charge on Caesar's right flank, which Caesar had anticipated, as he positioned his cavalry on the same side to counter it. Caesar had ordered his cavalry to counter Pompey's cavalry charge, but also told them to fall back after a few moments of engaging them, to make it look like Pompey's cavalry had routed them. This was the beginning of Caesar's genius plan, as he tried to bait Pompey's cavalry into chasing his cavalry back to Caesar's 3rd line. Pompey's cavalry had ended up taking the bait and chased them back to Caesar's 3rd line. Once Pompey's cavalry had gotten to the 3rd line, Caesar unveiled his genius plan and swung around his 4th line infantry, who were hidden behind his 3rd line. His 4th line was armed with spears, ready to meet Pompey's flanking cavalry. Pompey's cavalry was so surprised by this that they were almost destroyed immediately, and any remaining cavalry units were routed. Thus, Pompey's huge cavalry force was no more. Caesar then ordered his third line to flank Pompey's main force on Pompey's left, and then committed the rest of his forces to attack the rest of Pompey's army. Pompey's lines began to break, especially on his left, where he was positioned, behind his legions. Pompey, seeing that his cavalry was destroyed and his infantry lines broken, he ordered a retreat, giving Caesar a glorious victory. Many of those on Pompey's side, who were still alive after the battle, were granted a full pardon by Caesar, and most of them were integrated into his army, doubling his army size overnight. Pompey, who was running out of options after losing much support after this loss, fled to Egypt, where the kid pharaoh Ptolemy XIII owed Pompey a huge debt, as he had helped his father take the title of pharaoh during an Egyptian civil war, and he had also lended them legions that were still loyal to Pompey. Caesar followed Pompey to Egypt to try to convince him to stand down. However, once Caesar had arrived, Ptolemy had given Caesar Pompey's head on a silver platter, and demanded Caesar help him against his sister, Cleopatra, whom he was at war with over the Egyptian throne. Caesar, however, was so disgusted by seeing Pompey's head on a silver platter that he decided to side with Cleopatra instead, thus beginning another military campaign for Caesar, but this time it would be in Egypt. The war would go on from 48 BCE to 47 BCE, as Cleopatra and Caesar would win the war, as the siege of Alexandria was long and drawn out, but was ultimately victorious for them, and then won the Battle of the Nile, where Ptolemy drowned after his ship had capsized while fleeing from Caesar's forces. Though Caesar's civil war would not finish until 45 BCE, but at this point, however, the odds were in his favor, especially after crushing Pompey and Ptolemy. Eventually, he did end up destroying the rest of his enemies, who did not surrender to him in parts of Africa and Hispania. Though Caesar had an incredible military record, most historians would agree that Alexander was probably the #1 military general of the Antiquity era, as he was undefeated in battle, though it is still hard to say definitively who was the better general, as they were both born in different time periods, civilizations, and also had different upbringings. These two historic giants had epic military campaigns, and are mostly remembered for those military accomplishments. But how they governed their people would also be a crucial aspect of their legacies, and shape the world for many centuries to come. Alexander was not really known for his governing, as he spent most of his time as king of Macedonia conquering the Persian Empire, but that does not mean he did not pass certain forms of legislation during his reign. Though in most circumstances, Alexander did not write out these new laws himself, as he usually appointed certain legislators in their respective cities to create their own laws. One such example is when Alexander had taken back a former Greek island from the Persians during his invasion. This island was called Chios. In 333 BCE, he created the foundations for a new democratic constitution in Chios, and had legislators create new laws to fit this new constitution. After the laws were created, Alexander would have the final say on which laws would be passed and ratified into the new constitution. Besides delegating the responsibility of lawmaking to legislators, Alexander also ordered the execution of many Persians and even fellow Greeks and Macedonians for being enemies of the state. He had also arranged the marriages of his fellow military officers to Persian wives, hoping that it would bring lasting peace between his people and the Persians, though this would be mostly unsuccessful, as most of the marriages would not last more than a year. Alexander had also died at a young age, not giving him enough time to oversee his new empire, and make reforms as needed. Caesar, on the other hand, spent a lot of his time in between his military campaigns, and even after those campaigns, creating many different forms of legislation and reforms to the Roman Republic. In 59 BCE, the first time Caesar was elected as consul, he had passed a law giving land to upwards of 20,000 poor Roman citizens and Pompey's military veterans, which he had bypassed the Senate and the other consul, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, that had an objection to the bill. In 48 BCE, Caesar was appointed as dictator for an unspecified amount of time, an office that he had held the previous year but only for about 11 days, and it was only to watch over the elections for the next two consuls. Though Caesar's position as dictator was very different from many previous dictators, as he was also given permanent tribune authority, which meant that he was able to veto the Senate if they proposed any form of legislation or political reform. He was given the title of censor as well, which means he maintained the census, the government's finances, and supervised public morality. No Roman dictator before him had held those kind of offices while simultaneously being dictator. From 47 BCE to 45 BCE, he created reforms to the Roman Senate, increasing the seats from 400 to 900, and gave many of his supporters those seats, as well as some of his political enemies. Another reform he made was redistributing the grain dole to fewer people, and only to the poorest citizens who needed it the most. This was because the grain dole was a government program that gave out free grain to feed the vast population of Rome, but it was getting into the hands of the people who were already wealthy and thus did not need it. This also helped massively reduce the strain on the grain production. He would also implement new construction programs that aimed to rebuild parts of Carthage in Africa and Corinth in Greece, and repopulate those cities by incentivizing many Roman people to live there, by giving them plots of land. He created many more construction jobs for the Roman people, the most notable being plans to expand the Forum Romanum, where trade was conducted by the Roman people. This expansion was called the Forum of Caesar. He even created 2 statues of himself in the Forum, and a shrine dedicated to the goddess Venus Genetrix. Caesar would also go on to cut the city of Rome's debt by 1/3, as he forced an immediate repayment on all loans, but only at a proportional rate of the indebted person's overall wealth, to try to stop lenders from subjecting the indebted to absurdly high interest rates. He would even go on to extend citizenship to most of the people living in Gaul and Hispania, and even went as far as giving some of those people positions in the Senate. Arguably, his biggest reform came when he reinvented the Roman calendar, which would be called the Julian calendar and be used by most of Europe for more than 1,600 years, until it was replaced by the Gregorian calendar in 1582 CE. Caesar would go on to create and enact many more forms of legislation and civil reforms, but the ones we just talked about would be his most notable, and these pieces of legislation and reforms would go on to even further his glorified reputation amongst the common people. Both Alexander and Caesar used what we perceive today as very immoral tactics to cement their rule in their political systems. Alexander had his first cousin, Amyntas IV, murdered because he had a rightful claim to the Macedonian throne, and he was king of Macedonia for a brief moment while he was a child, before Alexander's father dethroned him. He also had 2 other Macedonian princes assassinated that were from the province of Lyncestis, and a Macedonian general whose name was Attalus, whom he feared would seek revenge against him because Alexander's mother had his niece Cleopatra Eurydice and her 2 children killed, as she thought leaving them alive might jeopardize Alexander's rule. Caesar, on the other hand, at least from what we know about him, had no records of him being murderous to gain political control. However, he did hire street thugs to harass and beat up many senators that opposed his land bill legislation when he was consul in 59 BCE. This would go on to gain him a lot of infamy amongst a good amount of senators later on, and be one of the many factors as to why many senators sided with Pompey during Caesar's civil war. Though during both Alexander and Caesar's time, doing these things was considered normal practice by politicians, but it still shows a similarity of shamelessness between these two, as they would do anything to gain political power. Even though they would be immortalized throughout human history, and also be considered by some to be living gods, their impending mortality soon caught up to them, however, like all legendary men and women. There is a lot of mystery surrounding Alexander's death in 323 BCE, as many sources differ in terms of the symptoms that described his very sudden fatal illness, though the symptoms that are most often mentioned are that he had a long burning fever, chills, and he was so weak he could hardly stand. Through the study of retrospective diagnosis, by many modern-day medical experts have concluded that it is very likely that he could have died from typhoid fever because of the symptoms that were described. Many other speculations from experts say that it could have been malaria, as malaria also shares similar symptoms. There is some speculation that it could have even been acute pancreatitis, though another big speculation is that he was poisoned, as it is very common throughout most of human history for kings and queens to be poisoned. Alexander's father was even assassinated, and the Macedonian crown was always under constant threat of being killed by political rivals. If Alexander was poisoned, his death would be similar to Caesar's death, as Caesar was assassinated by his fellow senators on the Ides of March, 44 BCE. His assassination was so devastating that the Roman populace mourned his death for months. And it was the nail in the coffin for the collapse of the Roman Republic, as his great-nephew and adopted heir, Gaius Octavius, would soon go on to transform Rome into an empire. To some degree, this is similar to Alexander's empire, as his death would cause his empire to collapse, resulting in smaller nations forming because Alexander did not plan out how his empire would be governed after his death. And many of his generals would fight brutal wars over who rightfully held claim over certain amounts of territory. This just goes to show how Alexander and Caesar held so much influence over their governments that once they died, a radical transformation to their governmental systems happened as a result. The actions of Alexander and Caesar withstand the test of time, as both men would see their legacies influence humanity for centuries. Alexander's legacy would go on to inspire many conquerors throughout all of human history, such as Pyrrhus of Epirus, Pompey the Great, Hannibal Barca, Napoleon Bonaparte, and many others, including Julius Caesar. His conquering of Persia brought upon the Hellenistic Age throughout a vast portion of the ancient world. From southeastern Europe, northeastern parts of Africa, small parts of India, and most of the modern-day Middle East would all be influenced heavily by Greek and Macedonian culture. Julius Caesar would also go on to inspire many political and military leaders, especially throughout Europe. Though Caesar was not an official emperor himself, his name would be synonymous with royalty throughout most of human history. The specific name of Caesar itself would come to be adopted by many Roman emperors, who were related to him by blood, and then later by Roman emperors who were not related to him, but wanted to further cement their legitimacy to rule as emperor. By the late 3rd century, as Emperor Diocletian would create the Tetrarchy, dividing the Roman Empire into 4 parts. He would use the title Augustus for senior emperors, and use the title of Caesar for junior emperors, who were the second in command, right below the Augustus. It would then even be adopted as Tsar, which was a Slavic pronunciation for the word emperor during the Bulgarian, Serbian, and Russian empires, from the 7th century up until the 20th century. Another adoption of Caesar's name was pronounced Kaiser, a German word for emperor, during the time of the German and Austrian empires, from the early 19th century to the early 20th century. Even to this very day, these two men have proven themselves as popular culture giants, having had movies, TV shows, and books depicting their legendary lives in fictional and non-fictional ways. Also, their military tactics and the way they ruled over their people are still studied and hotly debated to this very day, and there is no doubt that their names and legacies will continue to live on for the rest of human history. That was a detailed comparison of these two antiquity-era legends. Now it is time for you to decide who you think was greater overall. Was it the undefeated Alexander the Great, or the man who was very popular with the common people, Gaius Julius Caesar? Please rate your opinion on who you think was greater overall in the comments section below. And thank you for watching my first video on this channel. I will put all my primary and secondary sources as well as timestamps in the description below. There is definitely going to be a lot more content coming in the future, so stay tuned.